When the Lord commands that all things must be done by common consent, he never really explained what all things included, though he did give some examples. The business of the church was conducted at conferences. The primary business of conferences was priesthood ordinations and the issuing of licenses, but it included a wide array of decisions, including those listed from the minutes of conferences recorded in the history of the church. All decisions were voted upon at the conferences. Unfortunately, the law of common consent was not fully practiced under Joseph Smith. Joseph repeatedly violated this law, particularly during the Nauvoo period, when he secretly introduced polygamy and the temple ordinances. The members of the church at large were unaware of these practices and were never given the right to accept them by a vote of common consent. As the church confirms in its preface to section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the revelation was recorded in 1843, but its principles were known and practiced well before that date. It was not added to the scriptural canon until 1876, when polygamy had been openly practiced for many years. In December 1834, Joseph ordained Oliver Cowdery as an assistant president without a prior vote by the church. Though the ordination was according to the will of the Lord, a vote of the church prior to the ordination was required. As might be expected, Joseph's pattern of secret ordinations and the introduction of practices without the knowledge or consent of the members of the church continued with Brigham Young and successor presidents up to the present day. The most well-known practice of secret ordination is that of the reorganization of the first presidency after the death of a president of the church. A new president is set apart in a secret meeting of the remaining apostles in the temple. This follows a pattern set at the installation of Wilford Woodruff as president. The senior apostle, by rule, becomes the new president, who then selects his counselors. While the action is ratified at a solemn assembly held at the next general conference, ratification is not common consent. A vote of common consent, as the scriptures plainly state, must always be given before an ordination, and not after. Ratification does not absolve the violation of common consent, nor does the fact that this is a well-established pattern. In today's church, a vote of common consent has been transformed into a sustaining vote. To sustain is not to give consent. To sustain is to continue, maintain, or affirm. Sustaining, whether by vote or by action, means that an action has already taken place or is in process. Sustaining, by definition, comes after the fact. Consent must always be given before an action takes place. Though the Church states that all members have the right and privilege of sustaining or not sustaining actions and decisions, the truth of the matter is that there is a penalty for not sustaining. Besides, this statement by the Church tacitly admits that the decisions and actions of church leaders have already taken place before any sustaining vote. This is not consent. The Lord never used the word sustain or sustaining in the context of a vote in the Doctrine and Covenants. Alternatively, he commanded that a true vote of the church was necessary at least 9 times. Although the act of sustaining leaders is called a vote by the church, it cannot be considered so under any reasonable norms. The sustaining vote of a general conference clearly violates any semblance of a vote, as the following clip clearly demonstrates.
President Monson has asked that I now present the general officers and area 70s of the church for sustaining vote. Those in favor may manifest it. Those opposed, if any, may manifest it. President Monson, insofar as I have been able to observe, the voting in the conference center has been unanimous.
Note that when President Eyring conducts the vote, he does not look around the conference center to see upraised hands. He also adds the wording "if any," which is a form of suggestion to discourage the voting in the negative. Lastly, he notes that the voting in the conference center has been unanimous. Yet the Lord requires that the whole church is allowed to vote, with every vote counted to determine a majority. When were the other 15 million votes counted? What was the exact vote count? Of course, the brethren have not provided for a process for votes of the membership of the church to be recorded and counted. The temple recommend practice of requiring the sustaining of general and local leaders further degrades the law of common consent. One of the questions asks if the applicant sustains the president and other general officers of the church, as well as local leaders. An answer in the negative precludes receiving a temple recommend, which denies members access to the temple, its ordinances, and significant callings in the church. But true consent must always be given without penalty or any other form of coercion. The requirement of sustaining leadership radically alters the law of common consent into a practice of coercion, which was the adversary's plan from the beginning. The temple recommend is not the only violation of common consent in the modern church. The brethren now administer the church and govern the members using handbooks and manuals that have not been accepted by a vote of common consent. One of the handbooks, Handbook 1 for stake presidents and bishops, is even withheld from the general membership of the church. In summary, the law of common consent is a universal and mandatory principle which the Lord commands as a foundation for His church. Nothing is to be done in the church without prior permission, meaning consent. Consent cannot be constrained or penalized, otherwise it is no longer consent. Anything more or less than this leads to bondage.